Welcome to Veil of Epochs, where the forgotten corners of history are peeled back, one strange, unsettling truth at a time. Imagine this: you wake up in a wooden hut, mud floors underfoot, smoke stinging your eyes, and hunger gnawing at your ribs. You reach for breakfast. Is it porridge? Fruit? A warm loaf of bread? No, it's a blackened chunk of barley, harder than a stone, crawling with mold. You dunk it into a pot of greasy water pretending to be soup, the same pot your grandmother's been boiling all week, just adding scraps and praying for taste. Water is dangerous. Milk is rare. But there's beer. Always beer. And just a few miles away, your local lord is feasting on roasted swan, its feathers reattached for style, its beak painted gold. Welcome to the dinner table of medieval Europe. In this 2-hour journey, we'll explore the bizarre, the disgusting, the deadly, and the delightfully absurd realities of what people actually ate in the Middle Ages, from eternal soups and peasant bread that broke teeth, to porpoise roasts, gilded pies, and pies that screamed. Because in the Middle Ages, what you ate wasn't just about survival. It was about class, about faith, about power, and sometimes about madness. You're hungry. Not bored hungry. Not craving chocolate hungry. Not oh no, I skipped lunch hungry. But stomach shrinking. Vision blurring. Bone hollow hungry. The kind of hunger that turns dreams into loaves of bread. The kind of hunger that makes rats look edible. Welcome to Europe. Not the postcard version. Not the Renaissance. Not the cathedrals. Not the kings and queens. No. This is Europe before forks. Before sanitation. Before pizza. This is the medieval table. And tonight, you're the guest. In the year 1347, a peasant woman named Agnes kneels beside a fire. Her children are crying. Her husband hasn't returned from the fields. Dinner is bubbling, barely. It's not soup. It's hope, disguised as broth. There's a single turnip floating in the pot. 2 onion skins. A bone, no meat. Just bone. The stew has been cooking for 5 days. And it will cook for 5 more. She adds water. Not flavor. No salt. No spice. Just water. And she stirs it. Again. And again. And again. This was dinner. Night after night. For centuries. It wasn't a recipe. It was survival chemistry. In medieval Europe, food was not something you planned. It was something you foraged, hoarded, or begged for. Meals were shaped by weather, class, and plague. But mostly, by absence. The absence of enough. Let's put it plainly, there were only 2 kinds of meals in the Middle Ages, those for the rich, and those for the rest. If you were a peasant, your diet was a rotating disaster of porridge, stale bread, and boiled weeds. If you were a noble, you could eat birds that had been roasted in their own feathers. But here's the twist: even the nobility couldn't escape rot, disease, and maggots. They just had more decorative plates. The real luxury wasn't swan or pheasant or imported spices. It was calories. The average peasant needed around 2.500 calories a day for manual labor. Most barely scraped 1.500. That's assuming they could chew the bread. Yes, chew. Because bread in the Middle Ages wasn't soft. It was often black, rock hard, and full of grit from millstones. Dentists did not exist. But tooth loss? Oh yes. Everything was dictated by hunger, social status, marriage, religion, even the calendar. In bad harvest years, which was often up to 1/3 of the population might face famine, grain prices soared. People began mixing in bark, acorns, and ground up peas into flour. Sometimes they just boiled grass. Monasteries were flooded with beggars. Priests began sermonizing that hunger was divine punishment, a purging of sins, a test of humility. And yet, in the very same towns where children starved, nobles were throwing feasts with towering sugar sculptures and roasted animals stuffed inside other animals. A culinary version of grotesque matryoshka dolls. This divide wasn't just economic. It was spiritualized. Richness was seen as blessing. Hunger was your fault. So no one questioned why the bishop was fat and the altar boy was fainting. Hunger was holy. If you were starving, perhaps you were closer to God. And if you weren't, maybe you were sinning. The most horrifying part? It never changed. Unlike today, there were no new menu items, no trends, no restaurants, no discoveries, just seasonal repetition. In summer, it was too hot to store meat. In winter, too cold to grow anything. Spring brought hope and mud. Autumn brought rot. Same stew, same bread, same risk of food poisoning, day after day, week after week, year after year. For the common medieval European, eating wasn't a choice. It wasn't an experience. It was a prayer. May this meal not kill me. May there be something to eat tomorrow. May my children not cry themselves to sleep again. Food was never just food. It was class. It was faith. It was fear. What you ate, or didn't eat, told the world who you were, where you stood, and how long you'd last. So tonight, if you have dinner, if it's warm, if it's clean, remember Agnes, and the bone, and the 5-day soup, because in medieval Europe, that was a good night. And tomorrow? Well, we'll get into the beer. You wake up before dawn, aching from yesterday's labor. Your muscles burn, your mouth is dry, and your first thought is not about God. It's about food. But there is no food, just a bit of caked ash where the stew pot once boiled, a few crumbs of bread, and a hunger so deep it feels like your ribs are eating themselves. Forget bacon. Forget eggs. Forget even the idea of breakfast. If you were a peasant in medieval Europe, your morning meal was whatever hadn't spoiled overnight, if anything was left at all. Most days, you started with ale, a small beer, weak enough for a child but strong enough to kill bacteria. That, or you drank from a stream and hoped the upstream cow hadn't been decomposing too long. Solid food? If you were lucky, a scrap of coarse rye bread. Maybe a bit of cold porridge made the night before. Maybe a turnip. A very tired turnip. And if you were truly fortunate, say, if you hadn't paid your taxes in grain, you might find a dried apple half eaten by mice. That was breakfast. Bread was life. And death. For most peasants, bread made up to 80% of daily calories. But this wasn't fluffy white bakery bread. It was heavy, dark, and full of grit. Literally, stone ground flour meant bits of millstone got mixed in. With every bite, you were slowly sanding down your teeth. By age 30, many peasants had worn molars to the gum. Worse still, the bread was rarely made from pure grain. That was too expensive. Instead, they added peas, beans, acorns, and whatever was lying around that could pass for flour. Sometimes, the flour itself was rotten, moldy, wormy, sour. But you ate it anyway, because if you didn't, you died. Stone bread wasn't a nickname. It was an accurate warning. And by the time you were 40, if you made it that far, you could barely chew it anymore. Now let's talk about the main course, pottage. Pottage wasn't a dish. It was a strategy. A thick stew of whatever you had, barley, beans, leeks, onion, cabbage. Maybe a sliver of pork if it was a feast day. Most of the time, it was just green water, thickened with yesterday's leftovers, stretched with wild herbs, spiced with nothing. Because spices cost more than your house. And yet, this was the most nutritious thing a peasant might eat. The pot never emptied. It simply changed flavors as days passed. Some families boiled the same stew for weeks. They called it eternal pottage. In winter, It might freeze solid overnight and thaw again by noon. If it grew mold, scrape it off. If it smelled sour, boil it harder. If it moved, pretend it was seasoning. Peasants got creative. When flour was scarce, they ground up bark and mixed it into dough. When animals were dying, they ate the sick. When vegetables rotted, they dried them in the sun, then soaked them back to life. They foraged, not for mushrooms or berries, but for weeds, nettles, chickweed, wild mustard. These were boiled until flavorless, then mashed into the stew or spread thinly on bread like a primitive pesto. They didn't call it pesto. They called it not starving. And when food was truly gone, people ate animal blood, boiled bones, even boiled shoes. Yes, boiled shoes. Leather was edible in theory, and in desperation, the line between food and not food was blurry. And every winter, that line moved closer. Hunger in the Middle Ages wasn't silent. It groaned. It growled. It screamed. It made children hallucinate. And mothers weep. It twisted the body into brittle shapes, and the mind into madness. People wrote of hunger dreams, where fields were made of bread, and rivers ran with milk. Some even ate dirt. Not as a metaphor, literally. And yet, the church told them to give thanks, that hunger purified the soul. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. But until then, they'd get soup made of boiled roots. This was the peasant's truth, not the romanticized farm life with sunlight and singing, but days of aching labor, followed by meals so miserable they blurred the line between survival and surrender. In the modern world, when we say a meal is humble, we mean minimalist. But in the Middle Ages, humble food wasn't minimalist. It was scarcity made edible. It was grinding pain into powder and calling it flour. It was hunger, dressed as a bowl of stew, eating you from the inside. So next time you skip breakfast, remember, your medieval ancestors didn't. They just skipped everything else. You're thirsty, but you're not reaching for water, because you value your life. You reach for beer. Weak, warm, flat beer, brewed in a wooden tub, stirred with a paddle, cloudier than your memory of last week's meal. You hand it to your child. She's 5. She drinks it without flinching. Water in medieval Europe was complicated. It wasn't always deadly. It just frequently was. Streams flowed past livestock, past latrines, past the remains of last month's plague victims. Well, water was safer, if you had a well. Most didn't. So instead, they brewed. Beer was boiled. That meant bacteria died. And that, in the Middle Ages, was a revolutionary luxury. But don't imagine foamy pints or golden lagers. Medieval ale was dark, cloudy, and had the shelf life of milk in July. It wasn't refreshing. It was survival in a cup. And so, every home brewed. Every villager drank. Even the infants. Because beer wasn't a vice. It was hydration. Peasants didn't get drunk at dawn. Not usually. What they drank was called small beer, ale with very low alcohol content. Often between 0.5% to 2%. Just enough to make water safe. Not enough to make you forget hunger. It was brewed at home, in batches that fermented just a day or two. It spoiled quickly. It was weak, but it was theirs. Sometimes it had grains. Sometimes herbs. Sometimes it had things floating in it. But every morning, the household gathered to drink, not out of celebration, but out of necessity. You could live a week without bread, but not without water. And in the Middle Ages, beer was water that wouldn't kill you. Interestingly, the primary brewers of medieval ale were women, housewives, widows, nuns. They brewed to sustain life. It was kitchen work. It was labor. It was chemistry before anyone called it that. These women were called alewives, and they played a central role in village life. Their houses were marked by a broomstick, no, not for flying, but as a sign, Ale available here. Alewives brewed in wooden tubs. Added mash. Waited for fermentation. Then strained it into jugs. No refrigeration. No pasteurization. Just guesswork and divine luck. And when they weren't brewing, the monasteries were. Monks brewed stronger ale. Often reserved for feast days. Pilgrims. And high-ranking clergy. So even in beer, the hierarchy stood tall. Peasants drank thin, warm liquid bread. Monks drank golden, spiced, full-bodied salvation. Nobles? Imported wine. Of course, it may seem odd to imagine toddlers sipping beer at breakfast, but to the medieval mind, it was perfectly normal. Children were given small beer before they could walk. Not to intoxicate, but to hydrate. And yet, sometimes, they did get drunk. Fermentation was unpredictable. Without measurements or thermometers. Batches varied. One morning it was safe. The next, it knocked out your uncle before midday mass. In one English village, records describe 3 choir boys too drunk to sing at Easter. Another town banned ale during Lent because even the priests were forgetting their sermons. So yes, the Middle Ages ran on alcohol, not for pleasure, but because death was in every cup of water. And beer, even bad beer, was life. But not all beer was salvation. Some batches were spoiled. Others were spiked with hallucinogenic herbs, moldy rye, or outright poison. Sometimes this was accidental. Sometimes it was competitive business. Alewives competed. Villagers gossiped. And when someone died, it wasn't always the plague. In fact, brewing mistakes killed hundreds. Bread made with spoiled barley led to ergot poisoning, a condition so terrifying it looked like demonic possession. Shaking, seizures, visions, blackened limbs. They called it St. Anthony's fire, and it started in the bread and beer. So yes, you drank beer, but you prayed as you did. We romanticize history. We imagine tankards clinking in firelit halls. But for most medieval people, beer wasn't about joy. It was about fear. About need. About survival. They brewed not to forget, but to live long enough to remember. So if you're holding a glass tonight, clean and cold, remember the peasants who held mugs full of mud, memory, and maybe just a little mercy to them. The toast was simple: let this not kill us. And then they drank. It's summer. The air is thick. The flies are louder than the church bells. And your meat is moving, not figuratively. Literally, it's crawling. It stinks. It sweats. But you eat it anyway because there's no fridge, no freezer, no time to be picky. There is only food. And the slow death that follows. Imagine a world without refrigeration. No ice. No fridges. No cold storage. Just cellars. Smoke. Salt. And prayers. In medieval Europe, fresh food meant food you just killed. Yesterday's meat was today's problem. Milk spoiled in hours. Fish turned to mush by noon. And yet, life went on. People learned to preserve in ways that would make the modern stomach recoil. They smoked meat over dung fires. They pickled eggs in lye. They buried cheese in ash. They stored butter in barrels of brine. But sometimes, they just ate it rotten. Mold was a seasoning. Smell was ignored. Texture was negotiable. Because hunger didn't care how the meat looked. Let's be clear, they knew what fresh food was. They just rarely had it. Markets were infrequent. Hunting was illegal. Animals were slaughtered only when necessary. And once killed, you had to eat fast, or face the consequences. But consequences were often ignored. Pork covered in mold? Cut off the mold. Chicken oozing slime? Boil it longer. Fish stinking of ammonia? Douse it in vinegar. People didn't always call it spoiled. They called it strong. A strong cheese. A strong fish. A strong smell that opens the chest. Also known as food poisoning. And when it crawled, they picked off the maggots. Or didn't. We like to think the Black Death was the great killer of the Middle Ages. But food? Food was death in disguise. Spoiled meat brought on dysentery. Rotten grain could cause hallucinations. Bad milk gave infants fatal fevers. They didn't understand bacteria. They spoke instead of humors or corruption. If you vomited, you were imbalanced. If you seized, possessed. If you died, God's will. But the truth was simpler. You ate filth, because there was no choice, and sometimes it killed you. A family feast on sour venison could wipe out 3 generations before sundown. No warning. No cure. Just a long silence at the table the next morning. Still, not all food was fatal. Medieval people developed astonishing preservation methods. Salting meat packed in salt until it became a chewy, salty rock. Smoking fish hung for days over low fires. Absorbing soot and drying stiff. Pickling vegetables and even meat dunked in vinegar or brine to stall decay. Drying fruits laid out in the sun, often guarded from rats by shouting children. Honey, a natural preservative. Entire birds could be sealed in honey and kept for weeks. Of course, these techniques worked better for the rich, who had storage space, utensils, and staff. For the poor, it meant scraping mold off last week's bread and hoping the pig fat hadn't fermented into poison. Sometimes medieval food changed, and people pretended it was supposed to. Bread grew blue fuzz. That's God's crust. Beer turned sour. Holy ale. Meat smelled odd. An acquired taste. This wasn't delusion. It was strategy. When you can't stop food from rotting, you redefine what rotting means. This birthed entire categories of food we now find terrifying. Stinking bishop cheese, like chewing sweat. Salt cod, so tough it needed a hammer. Garum, fermented fish guts left to liquefy under the sun, then poured over everything. Flavor? That was a luxury. Survival? That was dinner. Today, we throw out yogurt if it's a day past the expiration date. We refrigerate ketchup. We wash lettuce in filtered water. We smell milk like detectives. But in the Middle Ages, rot was a companion. Every meal came with a gamble. And the stakes? Your stomach, your health, your life. So next time you see a spot of mold on your bread, don't complain. Just be glad it's not crawling. You haven't eaten in 2 days. But today, you're allowed near the Lord's manor, not to eat, but to watch. Inside, golden platters glisten. Swans arrive with their necks arched, feathers replaced after roasting. Sugar sculptures tower like cathedrals. Wine flows like prophecy. And outside, you chew a raw turnip. In medieval Europe, your food was your status. For the peasants, bread, onions, watery stew, and hopes that turnips would sprout this year. For the nobles, peacock stuffed with spices. Porpoise with almond sauce, yes. The sea mammal. Candied violets and gilded pies. Feasting wasn't about food. It was about power. To eat extravagantly was to say, I am above hunger. To serve spectacle on a platter was to prove, God favors me. Let's talk swan. Yes. The bird? Majestic, graceful, tough as leather. But to the noble, it wasn't for taste. It was theater. Swans were killed, roasted, then redressed, feathers carefully placed back on, neck curved, beak open, as if the bird had returned from death, just to impress your guests. It was like taxidermy, but edible. Porpoise? Technically a fish, according to the church, which meant you could eat it on fasting days. Nobles did. Boiled, spiced, and served cold. Reviews from the time? Unpleasantly oily. But again, it wasn't about flavor. It was about proving you could get a porpoise. And then came cockatrice, half pig, half bird, stitched together, roasted whole. Not because it made sense, but because it confused and amazed. The more unnatural the dish, the more divinely appointed the host appeared. Noble kitchens weren't just places of cooking. They were labs of illusion. Meat shaped to look like fruit. Fish dyed bright red with beetroot and saffron. Pies that exploded with live birds or frogs. Pullo. trauma. Yes. You heard that right. Some pies were filled with live animals, not to be eaten, but to leap out when cut, causing gasps and laughter. Dinner as theater. Table as stage. Guests as audience. Meanwhile, the cook, a magician in rags, risking his head if the dove flew too early or the peacock caught fire. Sugar in medieval Europe was rarer than gold. Literally, it was imported from far lands, hoarded like treasure, and used sparingly, unless you were a noble. Then it became architecture. Sugar castles. Sugar saints. Entire sugar armies marching across the table. Meant to be admired. Then shattered with spoons. And spices. Pepper was locked in chests. Saffron was kept under guard. Cinnamon was measured by the grain. To serve spiced food was to declare, I can reach the ends of the earth. And so, stews were drowned in cloves. Pies were laced with nutmeg. And even wine was boiled with exotic bark. It wasn't always delicious, but it always meant dominance. Now, you might wonder, what about the poor? They sometimes worked in the kitchens. They saw the opulence. They smelled the feasts. But they rarely tasted more than scraps. Leftovers, if granted, were stale bread crusts or gravy-soaked bones. Many stood outside during feasts, hoping for tossed meat or rotten fruit. Others sang or juggled for scraps. And a few just watched, wide-eyed, as a noble sliced into a pastry and a pigeon burst forth in panic. For them, food wasn't just scarce, it was spectacle denied. Today, food can be art. But in the Middle Ages, it was political theater. The rich didn't just eat, they performed eating. And every roasted swan, every gilded tart, every sugar sculpture was a line in a sermon they preached silently. I have, you don't. So while peasants boiled roots and prayed, nobles dined on birds that hadn't even been invented. Because medieval food wasn't just about flavor, it was about fantasy. And for most people, it was a fantasy they would never taste. The fire never goes out. The pot never empties. It simmers through snow and drought, through famine and harvest, through births, deaths, and weddings. It is not just food. It is a living thing, a creature made of bones, roots, herbs, blood, and time. This is the perpetual stew. In many medieval villages, the cooking fire was eternal. There was no gas, no stove. Lighting a new fire was a laborious task. So once lit, the communal pot, usually made of iron or clay, was kept warm day and night. Inside, a bubbling, murky broth made from whatever you had that day: cabbage, turnips, lentils, scraps of meat, stale bread, bones, herbs from the roadside, and sometimes mystery ingredients no one questioned. This was not a recipe, it was an ecosystem. Every day, you ladled some out. You added something new. You stirred. You prayed. The perpetual stew could last days, weeks, even years. In monasteries, the stew fed entire orders. In villages, it sustained families for generations. In some towns, it never stopped, a pot that passed from grandmother to granddaughter like an heirloom. Some historians record stews that simmered for over 20 years. This wasn't an exaggeration. It was necessity. When food was scarce, the pot was salvation. When meat was rare, bones gave it flavor. When illness came, garlic and sage were thrown in as cures. It was medicine. It was history. It was survival. Every spoonful contained yesterday, last week, and maybe 1349. Of course, the modern mind recoils. No refrigeration, no cleaning, no start or end date, just endless boiling, day after day, month after month. But this stew was self-sanitizing, or so they believed. The heat of the fire was thought to kill everything. As long as it never cooled, the stew was safe. And besides, the taste wasn't really the point. People didn't ask, "Is this good?" They asked, Is this food? Over time, the stew developed a depth, not of flavor, but of mystery. One villager might remember adding duck. Another swears there were leeks. Someone finds a pebble. Someone else finds a tooth. But still, they eat, because the stew is always there. Rain floods the fields, eat the stew. The Lord raises taxes, eat the stew. Plague takes half the village, the stew survives. It outlasts famine. It ignores war. It defies time. In a world where nothing was permanent, this pot, this boiling, bubbling, steaming pot, was as close to eternal as anything got. The stew wasn't just food. It was ritual. When babies were born, the midwife fed them a spoonful. When soldiers left for war, they drank from it. When elders died, a ladle of stew was poured on their graves. It was history. Simmered. And to touch the pot, to stir it, to taste it, was to become part of something bigger than yourself. You weren't just surviving, you were continuing. The perpetual stew didn't taste amazing. It didn't look pretty. It didn't smell fresh. But it was home. It was the backdrop of medieval life, always simmering, always waiting, always forgiving. Even when the world fell apart, the pot remained. And perhaps it remembered you long after you were gone. Because in the Middle Ages, food didn't just feed you. Sometimes it outlived you. You're thirsty. There's a river nearby, but it's where your neighbor washes clothes. The butcher dumps blood, and the pigs do what pigs do. The well, filled with frogs and rumors. So instead, you do what any rational medieval peasant would do. You drink beer, not to party, but to survive. Water in medieval Europe was a gamble. Sure, there were wells and springs, but no filters, no chlorine, no understanding of bacteria. Most people didn't even suspect water could cause illness. But they knew something. They knew that certain kinds of water made people sick, and others, like small beer, didn't. Hence, beer. Always beer. Forget what you know about modern beer. Small beer was weak in alcohol, usually 0.5% to 2%, murky, brown, and lukewarm, brewed in giant pots with grains, herbs, and sometimes boiled nettles or bog myrtle. Safer than water. The brewing process, boiling, fermenting, and filtering, killed bacteria. They didn't know that, but they knew beer didn't kill you like water might. So everyone drank it. Men, women, children, yes, even toddlers sipped small beer like juice. It was the Gatorade of the 14th century. Beer was served at every meal. Breakfast, bread, onion, and beer. Midday, stew, root vegetables, and beer. Supper, porridge, maybe dried fish, and yes, more beer. It was drunk at home, in the fields, in churches, in childbirth, at funerals. People brewed at home or bought from local alewives, women who ran small-scale brewing operations from their kitchens. And beer wasn't just hydration. It was liquid calories, thick, yeasty, and often full of grain residue. It filled your stomach when there was no meat. Yes, and no, small beer wasn't strong. You'd have to drink gallons to get tipsy. But sometimes they did, especially when the brew was stronger, like ale or mead, used for celebrations or to cope with grief, war, plague, or just another Wednesday in the Middle Ages. It wasn't unusual to see workers stumbling home from a monastery feast, priests slurring during mass, farmers arguing over imaginary sheep. But drunkenness was also judged, especially by the church. It was seen as a sin of gluttony, and sermons often condemned drinking to excess. Still, people drank, because the alternative, cholera, dysentery, death. Beer brought people together. Alehouses were not just places to drink, they were where you heard gossip, hired workers, found spouses, paid debts, sang sad songs and forgot sadder truths. Women, especially widows, brewed and sold beer to survive. Some even became rich. Until, of course, men took over the trade later and pushed women out, But that's another story. Ale was gendered, political, sacred, and profane. It was holy in monasteries, profitable in taverns, and in every case, essential. Beer didn't fix everything. It didn't save people from starvation. It didn't replace medicine. It wasn't immune to corruption. Sometimes it was spoiled, diluted, or poisoned, but it gave people something warm in winter, something safe in plague, something familiar in chaos. Even the sick were prescribed ale with herbs instead of water. It was the drink of survival, not celebration. And in a world full of pain and mystery, beer made life just slightly more predictable. The beer of medieval Europe wasn't just a beverage. It was infrastructure, a hidden backbone behind the working class, a ritual, a coping mechanism, a lullaby in liquid form. And though the people didn't know about germs or sanitation or microbiology, they knew the beer didn't kill them. And in an age where everything tried to, that was enough. So if you ever find yourself in 14th century Europe, remember, don't drink the water. Drink the beer. Even if you're 5 years old, it's morning in your medieval hut. Your stomach growls. You reach for a loaf of bread, not golden, not fluffy, not warm. Instead, it's black, hard, heavier than your axe, and if you're not careful, it might break your teeth before it fills your belly. When we think of bread today, we imagine golden crust, airy crumb, butter melting into a soft slice. But for most medieval peasants, bread was a weapon before it was a meal. Forget wheat. That was for the rich. The Lord's table. You got barley, rye, oats, even dried peas, mixed with ash from the hearth, bits of soil, chaff, maybe a handful of flour. If you were lucky. This created black bread, a dense, gritty, nearly inedible loaf that was often weeks-old. Peasant bread was often baked in communal ovens, reused, soot-blackened pits where sanitation was a memory. Sometimes, the flour was milled with primitive grindstones, which left actual rock dust in the dough. Yes, literal tiny stones. So what happens when you chew bread with rocks? You break your teeth, you swallow grit, you digest misery. By age 30, most peasants had teeth worn down to the gums. But hey, at least you didn't die of starvation. A cracked molar was better than an empty stomach. Let's talk flavor. Black bread didn't go bad quickly. It just got worse. After a week, it grew mold. After 2 weeks, it welcomed insects. In humid seasons, it could host ergot, a toxic fungus that caused hallucinations, convulsions, madness, death. Some historians believe entire villages went mad from eating ergot-infected bread, mistaking it for demonic possession or punishment from God. They weren't wrong. In a way, the bread really was cursed. Bread with social status made edible. White bread, manchit, for the nobles. Made with fine wheat, sifted flour. Baked soft, rye bread, for the middling folk. Black bread, for the poor, the peasants, the beggars, the forgotten. In some feudal towns, bakers had to mark loaves by quality. It was illegal to sell white bread to peasants. Because, how dare you chew like a lord? Even in hunger, hierarchy mattered. You could starve, sure, but you better starve in the right social class. Sometimes bread wasn't just food. It was a plate. Literally, trenchers, thick slices of stale bread, served as dishes. Stew was poured into them. Sauces soaked them. Grease bled into their core. At the end of the meal, rich guests tossed the soaked trencher to the poor. Poor folks ate the plate. No waste, no dignity either. When the only thing that holds your food is also your food, bread wasn't just a meal, it was life. So when grain prices spiked, riots exploded. Peasants stormed granaries. Villagers attacked bakers suspected of hoarding. Women were whipped for baking too white bread. And in times of famine, bread miracles were reported. Loaves appearing in chapels. Statues of saints sweeping breadcrumbs. Visions of heaven filled with golden crusts. Bread became divine and political, a symbol of power, scarcity, punishment if the king had it. And you didn't. God was angry with someone. Guess who? So if you lived in medieval Europe, your breakfast probably wasn't warm porridge or sweet rolls. It was black bread. It was moldy. It was hard. And if you were lucky, you didn't hallucinate after eating it. But it filled you. It stopped the ache in your stomach. It gave you one more day. Because in the Middle Ages, bread wasn't just part of the meal. It was the whole hope. You're starving. Your bread tastes like ash and heartbreak. And just a few miles away, in a candlelit hall full of velvet and gold, a nobleman is carving a roast swan. Not metaphorically. A literal swan. Its neck arched in death. Its beak painted gold. Its feathers reattached after roasting. For presentation. Welcome to the other side of the table. In a world where peasants chewed stone-laced bread and drank weak beer to survive, the nobility were eating like gods. Or, at least, what they imagined gods might eat. A typical noble feast could include swan stuffed with spices, peacock served with feathers reattached and its beak gilded, boar's head, apples in mouth, hedgehog-shaped pastries, pies that sang, literally, filled with live birds to fly out when opened, eels molded into religious symbols, dishes dyed with crushed flowers, minerals, or even gold leaf. It wasn't about nutrition, it was about spectacle. Medieval nobles didn't stop at poultry or pork. No, they ate everything. Porpoises, yes. Marine mammals, boiled in wine. Beavers, declared fish by the church, so they could be eaten on Fridays. Dolphins and cranes. Badgers. And sometimes cats and dogs during sieges. And on rare, royal occasions, whale tongue or heron pie. Why? Because they could. Because rare foods meant rare status. Because shocking the guests was the goal. In some elite feasts, gold was not just the decoration, it was part of the recipe. Cooks sprinkled crushed pearls, gold leaf, silver flakes onto dishes that already cost a peasant's annual wages. There were even medicinal beliefs. Some nobles thought eating gold purified the body, extended life, or elevated the soul. In reality, it just made your bowel movements priceless. For nobles, food wasn't just sustenance, it was politics, theater, seduction, power. Feasts were weapons. The bigger, stranger, costlier your meal, the more prestige you wielded. You invited guests not to feed them, but to dazzle them. You forced your enemies to witness your wealth in truffle-stuffed goose. You showed your peasants, this is how far above you I am. While you eat black bread, I eat a pie that screams. It was culinary propaganda. Even during famine, war, and plague, the feasts continued. The Black Death wiped out a third of Europe. Fields went fallow. Markets collapsed. Children starved. But in castles, feasts grew bolder, bigger, bloodier. Some historians believe nobles ate more during disasters as a way to prove divine favor, wealth, or simply to distract themselves from the rotting world outside their gates. While peasants buried their families, nobles debated whether peacock or porpoise paired better with spice wine. The contrast was not just cruel, it was cosmic. So, what would you eat if you lived in medieval Europe? That depends. Were you born lucky or born hungry? Because in a world where class was carved into your daily bread, your diet told your destiny. You might eat rocks and mold, or roast swan with a gilded neck. You might boil cabbage, or serve dolphin in saffron. But no matter what, everyone ate with fear. Fear of hunger, fear of God, fear of poison, fear of being seen as poor, or pretending to be rich. So next time you open your fridge and see plain old white bread, remember, at least it doesn't fight back.